What about the fill light? Let's take a moment. We're going to analyze the image that we shot in that last tutorial, and we're going to talk about our preferred methods of kind of controlling the fill light and how that control of fill affects the overall image. Now again, this is part of the process of diving deeper into these images, and the whole reason why is because we want to teach you all to be efficient with your lighting. When we're working inside the studio, we have the time, we have the leisure of setting up as many lights as we want. We can set up as many reflectors, we can do all that kind of stuff, and we can shoot with it without anything being moved, without anything being touched. But when we're on set, not on set, but out on location, when we're on location, not only do we have to carry out more gear, setting up that gear requires time, and then also you're dealing with, say, weather and wind and other things that are going to constantly shift and move gear around. So we need to use sandbags, and we need to place things, and we need to have assistants to hold stuff. And that's fine and dandy. We still do lots of location lighting with multiple light setups, but before going into that, I like to just kind of keep things a little more efficient, and if I can control my fill and get the results that I want by using kind of efficient steps like shutter speed to control the fill, then I will absolutely do that before asking one of my people to set up another light. And also keep in mind that when it comes to fill, an easier fill when you're doing location-based shoots is using a bounce, like a reflector. You can use a Westcott 5-in-1. You have a silver, you have a white, you have everything that you need inside of that. You can use a Westcott Scrim Gym or a California Sun Bounce. You can use a larger V-flat. You can take whatever you want and use a bounce, and that will oftentimes, well, every time, that is more simple basically than having to set up another flash. The only benefit of setting up another flash is that generally you can set up that flash and not have somebody stand next to it, whereas with a reflector, you typically are going to need someone just to hold that. But either way, again, I try to work efficiently. So let's look at this image and let's just kind of talk through some of these tips that I have for you all. And this is going to kind of just be a reminder on certain points. We're going to be reviewing certain key points as well as be talking about certain effects that fill is going to have over the image, or controlling fill with shutter speed. So what you can see here is we have the same image. This is the original image, okay, that we took. This is on the Sigma 120-300 at 300 millimeters. We're at f7.1, 1/200 of a second, and ISO 50. It was shot with the 2-bolt VB22s with our Profoto RFI 3-foot octa with the diffuser at around 1/2 to 1/1 power. Again, you need anywhere between 250 to 500 watt seconds to get enough light in this type of a scene on your subjects. So if I had the Profoto B2 and I was using just one of them, I'd probably be at 1/1 power. If I had the Bolt VB22s, I could use 2 at half power or 1 at full power. And again, it's going to depend on that light source distance to the subject. We know that. We covered that in the last tutorial. So our shutter speed is at 1/200 of a second, right? We mentioned that. If I were to step that down, now what I've done here is I basically simulated different shutter speeds. So we did this simulation in post just so I can give you guys a very controlled example of what it looks like. If I were to step that down to 1/4 of a second, what you end up seeing is that the background and the shadows all deepen by one stop, right? They all deepen just a little bit. But our highlights remained relatively the same. The highlights and the light that's on our face and everything, it's pretty darn similar to this first shot. You'll notice that it's just a tiny, tiny bit darker. But the flash power didn't change. Why would it be a little bit darker? It's because remember that the overall brightness of this area where the flash is hitting is not just your flash power. It's actually equivalent to the ambient light plus the flash power. So you're adding ambient to the flash power, that gives you the overall brightness. So if we cut ambient by one stop, well, we get less fill, but then this is going to go down just a little bit in that overall exposure as well, okay? So it's going to be affected, but not quite as much as the shadow areas of the image or the background areas of the image. Now, if I were to simulate 1/100 of a second for my shutter speed, so I'm basically going a stop brighter than this shot, you can see how her shadows on this side of the face open up a little bit more, right? The shadows in the arm, shadows everywhere, they kind of open up. We get more background. The shadows in the background kind of open up, the cactus and everything. And the area that has the flash hitting it also becomes just a little bit brighter. Why? Because once again, we added a stop of fill underneath that flash. So the flash is layering over that fill. So this is kind of the benefit and the drawback of using shutter speed to control fill. The benefit is that it's very simple to do. But the drawback is that it's not only controlling your background, but it's also controlling the fill in the shadows and the kind of brightness over this area. Now, if we want to, well, what we could do is if this brightness of this area that we're lighting gets too bright, we can just stop down the flash power, right? So that's easy to control. The one thing we can't control though is the background. The background is always gonna match kind of that fill. If you brighten the fill by one stop, it's gonna brighten the background by one stop, at least when we're using strictly shutter speed. Okay, so remember these tips. Going above 1/200 of a second shutter speed is gonna require your ND filter or HSS. And either of these options reduce effective flash power, right? If I throw a 3-stop neutral density filter, it reduces ambient light and flash power, because the flash is going to be 3 stops darker too when it hits the lens. So either of those are going to reduce, but when using HSS, if additional flash power is desired, you can, on certain flashes, use the ISO in conjunction with raising the shutter speed. And what this means is, let's say I'm using a pocket strobe like a Photix. When I go into high-speed sync, generally between 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th, 1/4000th, 1/8000th of a second, the flash power is all, the same, okay? It's giving me as much light as it can at every one of those steps. So it's all the same regardless. So if I'm using high-speed sync, and let's say that I want more flash power, but I want to keep the background the exact same exposure. This is a little review, by the way, on Lighting 101, so hopefully you guys still remember this stuff. Well, if I step up my ISO to say from 100 to 200, it's going to brighten the flash power by one stop, but it's also going to brighten ambient by one stop. But guess what? We know that shutter speed doesn't control flash power. And if we're in high speed sync, we can step that shutter speed up to whatever we want. So if I bring the shutter speed up by one stop and the ISO up by one stop, well, the shutter speed neutralizes the ISO when it comes to the background, but the ISO allows the flash to be one stop brighter. So we can keep making those adjustments up to 1/8000th of a second, but keeping in mind that every step up in ISO is going to reduce dynamic range, it's going to reduce image quality, and it's going to have those effects. And also, you're going to run into shutter speed limitations at 1/4000th on entry-level DSLRs or 1/8000th of a second on a basically advanced DSLR. Okay, so high-speed sync or neutral density filter. Well, again, we talked about this in detail in Lighting 101. With high-speed sync, you're going to be losing on a pocket strobe anywhere between 4 to 5 stops of power. But with a 5-stop neutral density filter, you're still losing 5 stops of light power. So which do I prefer? They're not equal, because I would always opt for the neutral density filter, and I prefer the Tiffen HT lineup. The high transmission lineup are absolutely impeccable optical quality. Make sure that you get a good optical quality ND filter, otherwise you're reducing image quality. So the Tiffen HT is fantastic quality, fantastic price. Why do I go that route though? Because certain flashes will actually reduce even more power when you keep stepping up the shutter speed. For example, our Profoto B2s, at 1/1000th of a second, they might be losing 3 to 4 stops of light. At 1/2000th of a second, they're losing 5 stops of light. At 1/4000th of a second, they're losing 6 stops of light. They go up to 7 to 8 stops of light loss depending on your shutter speed. So if you pop that neutral density filter on there, you can use any of these flashes at their original, at their factory power settings, and know exactly how much power you're getting on your shot, and not have to worry about burning out your batteries quickly, not have to worry about all the other stuff, how much light you're actually getting, and so forth. So I always prefer the ND option, at least until the point where high-speed sync gives me straight up my actual regular flash power. So when I get full power with high-speed sync and not a 5-stop light loss, that's when I'm going to convert over to high-speed sync. Did I say convert? Convert. That's when I'm going to convert to high-speed sync. All right, so let's go to point number 4. We can add ambient light fill by slowing down the shutter speed or by increasing the shutter speed to reduce ambient light fill. But remember, we talked about that and what effect it's going to have. It will also affect the background. Remember also that when it comes to the exposure area being flashed, your total exposure is equal to the fill plus flash, not just the flash by itself. Now, what this means is that if you are flashing over an area that has a decent amount of fill, make sure that you are lighting with the same color temperature of light as the fill light. Why? Because you want to match that light. Otherwise, you're gonna end up with a mixed lighting kind of effect, which is gonna mean that basically the light from this side of the face to this side of the face is not gonna match, and it's gonna look very strange. It's gonna reduce your overall kind of image quality, and well, it's not a flattering effect either. The time that that's most important is really just when the fill is actually present in the final shot. If you're shooting with the flash power so high that it's knocking out all the fill light, meaning that you have no fill, those shadow areas are just complete shadows, this doesn't really matter. But when we're combining and mixing flash plus fill, we need to balance those light sources so that they are equal in color temperature, or at least close to equal in color temperature. Okay, one last little tip here is to not add too much fill, because adding too much fill to an image flattens the image out. Now, for this shot, I'd probably say that the shadows are a little bit too much. For this shot, I'd probably say that it's been flattened out a little bit too much. We're losing some of that dimension in the body and in the shape by losing too much shadow. It's the same thing that if we went into Photoshop and we dodge and burn, and we kind of dodge all the shadows and we burn all the highlights and we even everything out, you end up with a very boring image, because the shadows and the highlights match, and you need to have shadows and you need to have highlights to have a compelling image. And that's why we shot it at this setting right here, because that gave us a good balance between shadows and highlights. We had a good amount of fill still where her face wasn't too dramatic like it is in this shot, and it looks great overall. So just remember that when it comes to that fill, too much or too little is going to negatively affect the overall balance and the mood of the shot. So kind of get that right balance in your image. So hopefully you all enjoyed this little exercise, just kind of analyzing what about the fill light, how can we control fill via shutter speed. Remember that as we get into lighting 301, we are going to be using more advanced techniques. We're going to be using reflectors, off-camera, additional flashes, like a second or a third light source to give us fill light and so forth. But for now, this is going to give you tons of control over any scene with just a single light.